Charlie Kirk, founder and president of Turning Point USA, out with a new book, Right Wing Revolution, How to Beat the Woke and Save the West. Charlie, endure it and not counterattack. That's sort of like telling Trump not to be Trump, right?
Well, it depends which debate. You know, the first debate back in 2020, I think President Trump interrupted a fair amount, and that one did not necessarily rate as well. But President Trump did really well with the debates back with Hillary Clinton 2016. Look, the president is one of the best debaters that we've seen. I think he's going to do very well, and you have to let just Joe Biden talk. There's some rules that have already been established for the debate, such as cutting mics and things of that might help President Trump. Look, the president's a fighter. The second debate last time, I thought he did very, very well. And look, it's going to come down to hopefully a question of the record, not the performance. I think that if the debate is less about who actually performs better and more about who actually presented better ideas, I think President Trump is going to be a triumphant winner of this debate.
Charlie, I've been covering a lot of presidential races and debates. It's rare that I'm the older one in the interviews, but I am in this case. I have never remembered a presidential debate that was about the substance and the issues than it was about the performance.
I'm hoping, Leland. A fair point.
Is that a policy? Hope's a policy now?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, what you're saying, does Trump have policy? I mean, I hope that it's about policy. I think that it's much better that way, but I think that's fair. And I think that especially in the TV era, you make a good point, that it's much more about who actually presents well and who looks good. And look, I don't necessarily think people think Joe Biden is necessarily the sharpest on his feet. I do think Newt Gingrich makes a great point. He's going to be hyper aggressive. He's going to try to get Trump off his game. I think the president needs to give calm, cool, and collected answers, and he certainly has a better agenda to run on. Very quickly, this is the first election since 1892 where we have two independent terms to compare. The Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison election, and I believe President Trump objectively was the better president. I'm very biased. I'm a supporter of his. But I think if we can at least get that presented to the American people, then it will be well received for President Trump. But you make a good point. In the entertainment area, it's usually much more about style than substance.
All right, so fair enough. And look, the polling bears out what you're saying. Most Americans agree they were better off under Donald Trump than they are under Joe Biden. That's just how Americans view this. But then you look at the polling on who's going to do better on the issues. On the economy, Trump wins by 9 points. On immigration, Trump wins by 12 points. Abortion, which to some voters is extremely important, but not many, Joe Biden wins. That's understandable. Then you look at the Real Clear Politics average of polls. Trump-Biden tied. Is there anything to explain the difference of leading so much on the issues and tied in the actual head-to-head poll, other than people don't like the mean tweets?
Well, I think two or three things. First of all, one of those was a state poll you showed, a Pennsylvania poll. The other one was a national poll. So on the state polls, President Trump was still up 2 or 3 points on some of the averages. The national polls, it's quite tighter. And I anticipate if Donald Trump wins the popular vote nationally, I'll be shocked. In fact, I don't think he'll win the popular vote nationally. However, I think that Joe Biden has spent a lot of television time, a lot of advertising, over $50 to $75 million in the last couple months. And let's look at this. If you were to tell me that Donald Trump would be a convicted felon, he would be on pseudo house arrest in a courtroom for 4 to 6 weeks, and that Joe Biden would spend $50 to $75 million almost unopposed, I would think Joe Biden would be winning in the polls. The fact that it's even tight and close, and we're starting to see Minnesota and Virginia tighten and close in, I think President Trump is in a great spot. It's not perfect by any means. We have a lot
so
of
it's
work
his. Well, you're setting up, right? It's his to lose, right? That
No,
he's
I
in a
think
great
it's a
spot. Hold on.
I-
Let me just ask the question. It's his to lose. So Maggie Haberman, Trump's favorite reporter to talk about how much he hates her, was on CNN talking about debate prep. Take a listen.
He knows that this has to go well for him. He has said to people multiple times that he knows that he interrupted too much. I anticipate President Biden will reference his criminal conviction. Now, I'm quite confident, based on my reporting, that Donald Trump will then point to Hunter Biden's criminal conviction.
You are a Trump confidant. There's no question about that. We know that there are people talking to him saying exactly what you're saying, what Newt Gingrich is saying, of, look, hold your fire, let Biden goad you, and don't take the bait. Is he listening?
I think so, and I think he wants to win. Look, President Trump, he's a fighter, and he hates to lose. I mean, we'll end up seeing what the debate looks like. I think the president will be at his best if he can have a stoic performance and he allows Biden to just present his case to the American people, and then he responds calm, cool, and collected.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.